It is well known that religion and communism, both writ large anyway, are anathema to each other, irreconcilable oppositional forces, if you will. It should come as no surprise then that with the onset of the Cold War, various religious organizations came into conflict with communist groups. But what happens when members of some of those religious groups start preaching messages that echoed the aims of the communists? Social equality, removing injustice, lifting people up here in this life rather than with promises of the afterlife. Well, in Latin America, this is exactly what did happen. I'm your host David, and today we are going to look at liberation theology and how it impacted the Cold War. During the Cold War, the lines between religion and revolution blurred in ways that made both Washington and the Vatican very, very nervous. In the jungles of Nicaragua, Catholic priests handed out rifles and poetry. In the slums of Brazil, nuns ran Bible study groups that looked suspiciously like Marxist organizing cells. And in El Salvador, a soft-spoken archbishop with a radio microphone became the most dangerous man in the country until a death squad took him out at the altar. This wasn't some fringe cult or guerrilla uprising dressed in religious robes. This was liberation theology, a radical movement within the Catholic Church that emerged in Latin America in the 1960s and 1970s, declaring that God was not neutral in the struggle between the rich and the poor. In fact, according to its architects, the Church had a moral duty to stand with the oppressed, and to oppose the systems that kept them that way. For Cold War powers, as you might imagine, this was a problem. In Washington, liberation theology was seen as little more than communism in a cassock. In Rome, it was viewed as a theological time bomb that threatened to tear the church in two. And across Latin America, dictatorships propped up by US dollars began treating priests, nuns, and missionaries as, well, enemies of the state. To understand how a movement born in Bible study groups and peasant cooperatives ended up on CIA watch lists and resulted in a trail of saints, martyrs, and suppressed revolutions left in its wake, we have to look back at the 1960s, a decade of revolution not just in the streets, but in the pews. So at the time, the Catholic Church in Latin America was still largely an ally of the status quo. Bishops blessed presidents, priests ran elite schools, and Sunday sermons rarely touched on hunger, inequality, or state violence. But outside the cathedral walls, the continent was a powder keg. Military dictatorships had seized power from Buenos Aires to Brasilia. Land was concentrated in the hands of a few, and millions of rural and urban poor lived without access to clean water, electricity, education, or the vote. But then something unexpected happened. The Catholic Church started paying attention. In Rome, the Second Vatican Council, Vatican II, was held between 1962 and 1965. It had called on the global church to modernize. Priests were told to stop preaching from the clouds and start walking among the people. Latin American bishops took that directive to heart. In 1968, they gathered in Medellin, Colombia, for a conference that would change the church and the Cold War forever. The Medellin Conference produced a document that reads less like a sermon and more like a manifesto. It spoke of institutionalized injustice, social sin, and the need for a preferential option for the poor. In other words, God isn't neutral, he's picking sides, and he's not with the landlords. At the heart of this emerging theology was a quiet, bespectacled Peruvian priest named Gustavo Gutierrez. In 1971, he published a book called A Theology of Liberation, which argued that the Christian promise of salvation wasn't just for the afterlife, it was a mandate for changing the world right now. He reinterpreted the gospel as a blueprint for dismantling oppression. Think less of turn the other cheek and more of let my people go. Gutierrez's ideas weren't just spiritual, they were surgical. He argued that poverty wasn't a moral failing, it was the result of unjust systems, often maintained through violence. That meant Christian love required not just charity, but confrontation. In practice, that could mean organizing landless farmers into cooperatives, demanding labor rights, or confronting military regimes. And yes, sometimes it meant that priests ended up on the same side of the barricades as guerrilla fighters. The result was a movement that came to be known as Liberation Theology, and it spread like wildfire. Throughout the 1970s, Catholic priests, nuns, and lay leaders began forming what were called base ecclesial communities. small grassroots groups where people read the Bible together and then discussed how it applied to their daily struggles. In some villages, these groups became the only space where the poor could speak freely about land theft, wage abuse, or police brutality. To their supporters, this was the church finally living up to its mission. To dictators, bishops with a conscience were now indistinguishable from communists with a Bible. And to the United States, which was already seeing Latin America as a Soviet chessboard, this looked less like a spiritual revival and more like a holy insurgency. Liberation theology didn't stay confined to books and bishops' conferences either. It took on flesh in the lives of real people: priests, poets who were priests, bishops who defied bullets, and nuns who traded their habits for hiking boots and disappeared into war zones. So, who were some of these people? Let's start with Archbishop Oscar Romero, perhaps the most well-known face of the movement, and its most haunting martyr. Romero wasn't always a firebrand. He started out as a conservative cleric in El Salvador, deeply uncomfortable with the political leanings of his more activist priests. But when his close friend, Father Rutilio Grande, was assassinated for organizing among rural peasants, something snapped. Romero began to see that silence was complicity. Every Sunday, his homilies were broadcast across El Salvador on the radio. They listed the week's human rights abuses by name. He read the death tolls. He called on soldiers to disobey unjust orders. And on March 23, 1980, he made his most dangerous plea yet. The church preaches liberation. The church, the defender of the rights of God, of the law of God, of human dignity, of the person, cannot remain silent before such an abomination. We want the government to face the fact that reforms are valueless if they are to be carried out stained with blood. In the name of God, in the name of this suffering people whose cries rise to the heaven more loudly each day, I implore you, I beg you, I order you, in the name of God, stop the repression. The very next day, he was shot through the heart while saying Mass. He collapsed at the altar, a martyr in a cassock. Now, in Brazil, the movement took a slightly different tone. There, Leonardo Boff, a soft-spoken Franciscan theologian, became the intellectual heart of Liberation Theology's second wave. His work emphasized that the church should not just serve the poor, but listen to them and be shaped by them. He challenged the church's obsession with hierarchy, and he paid the price. In 1985, the Vatican silenced him, forbidding him to speak or write publicly. Then there was Ernesto Cardenal, the poet-priest of Nicaragua. When the Sandinistas overthrew the Somoza dictatorship in 1979, Cardenal joined the new revolutionary government as Minister of Culture. He believed that building a just society was a sacred act. Pope John Paul II did not agree. In 1983, cameras captured the Pope wagging a disapproving finger at the kneeling cardinal on the Managua tarmac. Cardenal was banned from performing priestly duties for decades. And then there's Dom Helder Camara, the Archbishop from Brazil, who once said, "When I feed the poor, they call me a saint. When I ask why they are poor, they call me a communist." He never picked up a gun, never led a protest, but his sermons, his writings, and his tireless advocacy for the favelas made him a threat to Brazil's military dictatorship. Together, these figures, Romero, Boff, Cardenal, Camara, were the conscience of the church and the nightmare of the powerful. They gave liberation theology a face. Sometimes that face was bearded and stern. Sometimes it smiled softly behind thick glasses. But always it spoke with the clarity of a gospel that had decided, finally, to pick a side. This is probably the best place to mention that there are claims out there that liberation theology was invented by the KGB. And while it is certainly true that the Soviet Union tried to leverage and provide support, even if sometimes only of the moral variety, there is no current documentary evidence that Moscow was the instigator of this grassroots religious movement. These claims have largely been fueled by unsubstantiated claims made by a Romanian Securitate General, Ion Pacepa, after his defection in the late 1970s. Perhaps someday evidence will be revealed, but until such time, these claims can be dismissed. Okay, so by the late 1970s, liberation theology was no longer just a theological movement. It was a political powder keg. Keep in mind that across Latin America, regimes had, with backing from the United States and dominant institutions like the Catholic Church, spent decades perfecting the art of repression in the name of anti-communism. Now they were facing something they hadn't prepared for: priests with microphones, nuns with notebooks, and campesinos quoting the gospel as they organized land occupations. In El Salvador, the church became both a sanctuary and a target. The country was slipping into civil war. The ruling oligarchy, backed by US military aid, was desperate to hold on to power. Priests and nuns, once seen as neutral, spiritual caregivers, were now branded subversives simply for living in poor communities or teaching people to read. After Archbishop Romero's assassination in 1980, things got worse. That same year, 4 American churchwomen, Maryknoll's sisters, Ida Ford and Mara Clark, Ursuline sister Dorothy Cazell, and lay missionary Jean Donovan were abducted, raped, and murdered by Salvadoran National Guardsmen. Their crime? Feeding the hungry, running health clinics, giving dignity to the displaced. And the Reagan administration's response? Well, let's just say it wasn't canonization. UN Ambassador Jeane Kirkpatrick famously quipped that the women weren't just nuns, they were political activists. The implication? They had it coming. That moment crystallized the moral murk of US Cold War policy in Latin America. In the name of fighting communism, the US was arming regimes that were quite literally killing nuns. And it wasn't an isolated incident. Over the course of El Salvador's civil war, dozens of priests and thousands of catechists were murdered for their work with base communities. To the military, anyone teaching poor people that they had rights was a guerrilla in a clerical collar. In Nicaragua, the dynamic was different, but no less explosive. There, liberation theology wasn't just working alongside revolution, it was part of the revolution. When the Sandinistas overthrew the Somoza dictatorship in 1979, several priests took positions in the new government. Ernesto Cardenal was Minister of Culture, his brother Fernando ran education, Miguel de Scoro became foreign minister. They weren't sneaking in theology between Marxist lectures, they were integrating it. To them, the gospel and socialism were not enemies, they were teammates. This sent alarm bells ringing in Washington and in Rome. President Reagan labeled the Sandinistas a totalitarian threat. The CIA began training Contra forces to destabilize the new regime. Pope John Paul II, fiercely anti-communist, publicly reprimanded the priests in government and later suspended their ministries. But in Nicaragua's barrios and rural zones, base communities flourished. Literacy campaigns were infused with Christian ideals. Health brigades were organized by religious laypeople. For a brief moment, it seemed like a whole country might be remade in the image of liberation. Meanwhile, in Brazil, the movement didn't topple regimes, but it did build power. Thousands of ecclesial-based communities empowered the poor to demand land reform, organize unions, and eventually vote. Some would go on to join the Workers' Party and help elect Luis Ignacio Lula da Silva, a former metal worker and union leader, eventually to the presidency. Liberation theology, it turned out, could do more than challenge dictatorships, it could plant the seeds of democracy. By the mid-1980s across the region, liberation theology had become a paradox, banned by generals, punished by popes, and yet still growing. In the shadows of war and repression, it offered something subversive and sacred, the belief that justice was not only possible, but holy. Of course, liberation theology wasn't just upsetting dictators and landlords, it was giving ulcers to 2 global superpowers, the United States of America and the Vatican. Let's start with Washington. By the 1980s, US foreign policy in Latin America had boiled down to a single obsession: stopping the spread of communism. To the Reagan administration, the Cold War wasn't just a chess game, it resembled a holy war. And any movement that looked remotely Marxist, even one that started with Bible study, was treated as a potential Soviet proxy. Liberation theology's sin, in Washington's eyes, was not just that it criticized inequality, it's that it did so using a vocabulary that sounded dangerously red. Oppression, class struggle, structures of sin. To Reagan's team, this wasn't the Sermon on the Mount, it was the Communist Manifesto investments. In 1980, a group of hardline policymakers drafted the Santa Fe document, a blueprint for US intervention in Latin America. In it, they warned that liberation theology was part of a leftist cultural takeover and needed to be neutralized. The US Information Agency even floated a theory that liberation theology was a KGB invention. It was a suggestion that Gustavo Gutierrez was taking notes from the Kremlin. But what did US policy look like on the ground then? Well, it looked like CIA briefings that linked Jesuit schools to guerrilla groups. It looked like military training programs for Latin American officers, many of them educated at the US-run School of the Americas. Check our recent episode on that if you haven't already. These officers were taught to see base communities as breeding grounds for insurrection. And it looked like silence, or worse, spin, when American-backed regimes murdered priests and nuns. But if Washington feared liberation theology as a threat to capitalism, Rome feared it as a threat to the church itself. Pope John Paul II had spent his early priesthood under communist rule in Poland. He had seen Marxism up close, and he didn't like what he saw. So when he looked at Latin America and saw priests quoting Karl Marx alongside Jesus Christ, alarm bells rang. The Vatican's response was surgical. In 1984, Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, yes, the same Ratzinger who would later become Pope Benedict XVI, issued a document titled Instruction on Certain Aspects of the Theology of Liberation. It affirmed the Church's commitment to the poor, but it came with a warning: don't mistake Marx for Matthew. The gospel, Ratzinger said, was about freeing people from sin, not from capitalism. And Rome didn't stop at memos. It started investigations. Theologians like Leonardo Boff were summoned, silenced, or sidelined. Priests who took government posts, like Ernesto Cardenal, were stripped of their ability to perform sacraments. Bishops were quietly replaced with more conservative appointments, and Vatican pressure eventually pushed liberation theology from the center of church life to its margins. But the movement never died, it just moved. It moved into the favelas, the refugee camps, the dusty villages where priests kept preaching and nuns kept organizing long after their names had disappeared from Vatican directories. To the powerful, liberation theology looked like a theological rebellion. But to the people living under regimes armed by Washington and scolded by Rome, it was something far simpler: the radical idea that God was on their side. Of course, by the 1990s, liberation theology looked like it was losing. The Cold War was over, military dictatorships were giving way to democracies, albeit uneven ones, and the Vatican had successfully marginalized many of the movement's most vocal theologians. Leonardo Boff had left the priesthood, Ernesto Cardenal had been suspended, Gustavo Gutierrez was under doctrinal review, and the base communities that once thrived in the shadow of repression were now competing with televangelists, Pentecostal megachurches, and apolitical NGOs for hearts and minds. Liberation theology, it seemed, had been defanged, tamed by Rome, outflanked by neoliberalism, and forgotten by history. Except, not quite. Because while the headlines moved on, the ideas never really died. They just went underground, again. In the early 2000s, a new generation of theologians, many of them women, indigenous, or lay people, began to pick up the torch. They didn't always call themselves liberation theologians, but their work carried the same DNA. Theology rooted in lived experience, focused on justice, and radically committed to the marginalized. Feminist theology, indigenous theology, eco-theology, black theology, all of them owed a debt to the fire that had been lit in Latin America decades earlier. Then, in 2013, the impossible happened. A pope from the global south was elected. Pope Francis, born Jorge Mario Bergoglio in Argentina, had a complicated history with liberation theology. As a Jesuit provincial during the dictatorship, he had clashed with some of the movement's more radical members. But as pope, he began to reclaim its language, and more importantly, its priorities. He spoke of a church that is poor and for the poor. He warned of the idolatry of money. He called inequality the root of social evil, and he invited none other than Gustavo Gutierrez, once treated with suspicion by Rome, to the Vatican for a public embrace. It was the ecclesiastical equivalent of a Cold War détente. Granted, Pope Francis wasn't handing out Marxist pamphlets, but he was signaling something clear. The Church was ready to listen again to the voices it had once tried to silence. Today, liberation theology lives on, not as a monolith, but as a method, a lens, a commitment. Wherever people of faith read scripture in the rubble of war, in the margins of the economy, or in the shadow of power, the question remains: what does the gospel demand here? Liberation theology never promised victory or even practical solutions. It promised solidarity, that the church, at its best, would stand where it's always supposed to stand, with the crucified, not the crucifiers. We hope you've enjoyed this episode, and to make sure you don't miss our future work, please make sure you subscribe to our channel and have pressed the bell button, which is currently working to spread the Gospel of Marx. Is that right? Please consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/thecoldwar or through YouTube membership. We can be reached via email at thecoldwarchannel@gmail.com. This is the Cold War Channel, and as we think about the Cold War, please remember that history is shades of grey and rarely black and white.